again, everybody. Welcome to our webinar today, the second part of our three-part series on building trust and partnership with teams and families in long-term care with a relational approach. Your microphone is muted today, but if you have any questions throughout the presentation, please type them into the chat box. And then again, please note that we'll also be sharing the slide and a link to the recording in a post-webinar email in the days following today's session. Next slide. So I want to take a moment for land acknowledgement on the slide. We wanted for you to reflect as well on the land where you are in. And if you're not familiar with that, we can visit the link that we'll share in the chat box shortly. I'm coming to you today from London, Ontario, which is located on the traditional lands of the Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, and the Lenape peoples, on lands connected with London Township on Sombre Treaties of 1796 and the Dishwood One Spoon Covenant Wampum. At OCO, our work is carried out while acknowledging the Indigenous peoples of the lands that we're on today. This land is home to many First Nations, Métis, and Inuit peoples, and acknowledging reminds us that our great standards of living is directly related to the resources and friendship of Indigenous peoples. Next slide. So here's our agenda for today. Very similar to last week. We'll start with welcome and a little bit of introduction to OCO. Then I'll pass it to Deborah Bakti for the second part of our three-part series presentation. We do have about 10 minutes for discussion and questions towards the end of our presentation, just before we wrap up. Again, however, though, if you have at any point you have questions throughout the presentation, please feel free to type them into the chat box. Next slide. Again, welcome to our webinar today. My name is Fardosa Halani, and I use a she, her pronoun. I am the Knowledge Exchange Lead at OCO for the Essential Care Partner Support Hub. If you can take a moment to introduce yourself as well in the chat box with possibly your name, your role, and the organization you're coming in from, that would be amazing. So at OCO, some of you may know about it. The center of our work revolves around caregivers. And then we do collaborate with caregivers to create our programs and services, which are all free of charge. And we do this with a number of different working groups and caregiver advisory panel. With that being said, I'm pleased to invite again Deborah Bakti, presenting on the second part of our three-part series on building trust and partnership with teams and families in long-term care. Welcome, Deborah.
Thank you so much, and hi, everybody. I hope you've had a great week from when we touched base last time. And hopefully you also had an opportunity to work with some of the new material that you learned during our time together. We are going to be, well, actually, what I'd like to do is just to start with a recap of this whole concept of designing your care team and family relationship strategy, because it is foundational for all 3 weeks that we're together. And as a reminder, part of that is how you onboard your families right from the start. And secondary to that is in building your culture on the way in, one family at a time. When we're able to focus on being intentional with a well-designed onboarding process and experience, you are then naturally building your culture on the way in with every new family and resident and every conversation that you're having with them. And then by that, you're able to take the lead and be the guide that your families need and want. And remember, the families may not even be aware that that's what they're looking for, because they're experiencing their own admission anxiety that we spoke about last week. And are also dealing with those 3 gaps, being the knowledge gap, the emotion gap, and the identity gap. So today we're going to be talking about what I refer to as narratives. The narratives being those limiting beliefs, assumptions, stories, labels that sometimes we put on people. And we're going to be looking at it from both the staff perspective and narratives or limiting beliefs that staff can have about families, and the limiting beliefs and stories and narratives that families can sometimes come into long-term care with. So you've got the second part of your workbook. You could actually just even take the front page off, because you'll notice that I've started with page 9. And then next week, you'll get the third and final section of the workbook so that you can put it all together. And there's going to be 2 breakout sessions today. that will give you an opportunity to connect with other people on the call, and you will be putting you to work a little bit based on what we're talking about today. So I want to start by sharing a story that I think will help to illustrate some of the challenges that having limiting beliefs and narratives about each other can have. And I heard the story. I was doing some group training with a group of direct care staff. And Amy was one of the participants in the program. And we had just been talking about the power of curiosity and how it can cancel out judgment. And we're going to be talking about that later on in our time together today. And so she was sharing how just that morning, there was a resident, a gentleman with his two daughters that were moving into their home. And there were two of her coworkers that were involved in the move-in. And they had, after their move-in experience with the family and the resident, they came up to Amy and they basically said, "Oh, you're not going to believe this new family. They are going to be a nightmare. These sisters were so rude and they weren't helping with answering our questions. And it was just so frustrating. And, you know, like we've had families like this before. I just hope that I don't get scheduled on the floor where they're going to be, because they're just going to be a nightmare." And so Amy, fresh in her mind, was this idea about how you can build connection through curiosity. She decided to take the initiative, and she went to the family and introduced herself. And she just brought some curiosity. She's like, you know, she introduced herself and said, just welcome to our home. Just wanted to learn a little bit about you and your experience so far and what's been occurring for you. And, you know, she was getting some pretty short answers and was really feeling the resistance and some of that friction that her coworkers had talked about. And then she decided to ask the question that took courage, but also was able to break open the conversation in a more productive way. And she asked them, "I'm curious, what are you most worried about moving your loved one into our home?" And the two sisters kind of looked at each other, like they weren't even too sure what to do with that question, because nobody had asked them that question. They hadn't been thinking about it. But, you know, as you can tell, it's a pretty vulnerable question for Amy to have asked. And so one of them said, "Okay, well, I guess you're going to find out sooner or later. Our dad, he's been saying things that, quite frankly, are really upsetting and pretty inappropriate. And he's been doing things that, like, he never would have done in his life before. And it's embarrassing and it's causing a lot of stress and anxiety for all of us because we don't know what to do. So we're just kind of thinking that it's only a matter of time that someone from here is going to call us and say, you know what, your dad, he's too much. He's misbehaving. We can't control him. He's causing all sorts of issues. So you're just going to have to come in and pick him up and find somewhere else for him to live, because we just can't deal with him. It's just too much." And Amy, oh my gosh, she did such a great job, because first of all, she related to them. And after listening to their worries and their fears, she was able to say, you know, this has got to be really, really hard for you experiencing this with your dad. I can't imagine how that must feel for you, seeing all of this change and needing to make a really big decision. And then she provided a little bit of education and assurance. And she said, you know, this is what we do. This is the service and the support that we provide in long-term care. In fact, in our home, it's close to 80% of our residents who have what you're describing as behaviors. We call them expressions. And then she provided some education on the language of dementia. And she said, you know, we've got you. And we are knowledgeable, we are trained. And I completely understand how heartbreaking and hard this must be for you. And that ability to validate what they were feeling, because she said to them as well, what you're feeling is normal. It can be overwhelming and hard to process if it's not something that you've ever dealt with before. But we're here to help you along the journey as he continues to change. And we know that this is his disease, the disease process. And Amy was able to go back to the two other staff who maybe by that time had shared their experience of the rude family with other people, and was able to reset and say, I had this conversation, and it's not that they were trying to be rude. They were experiencing their grief and their fear and their worry, and that's how it was showing up. And the staff were kind of like, we didn't think of it that way. Now, we don't know what could have happened if Amy had never intervened, but I would imagine that's not the way to onboard your family right from the start and establish that relationship. And I think the family would have felt that they could let their guard down and start building that trust and recognizing that the team there are there to help support them. So as you can see in that example, there was the limiting belief or the narrative that rude family, they're going to be difficult, going to make life hard for us. And you've got the family with their narrative was basically, they're not going to be able to take care of our dad. They're going to judge us and they're going to judge him. And then they're going to want to kick him out. And the thing with those two narratives is that they weren't true. Limiting beliefs do not equal facts. And so the opportunity to look at what are some of the narratives or the limiting beliefs that we have, that they're not factual, but it's the stories that we're making up in our head to make sense of somebody else's behavior or comments that could end up leading us down the wrong path. With the hundreds of homes that and staff, thousands that I've worked with over the years, and I hear some of the similar patterns of the narratives, and we're going to be doing some work on the narratives in our breakout. But I've kind of created a bit of a composite. What I would say is a pretty standard narrative that I've heard over and over again, and it kind of goes like this. Difficult families, just another cost of doing business in seniors care. Every single home has at least one difficult, passionate, involved, challenging, whatever word you want to use to describe that we label families. So you gotta avoid making eye contact. If you need to turn around and head into another room or head back down the hall, just avoid any kind of contact or eye contact. If you have to bend over and tie your shoelaces, even though your shoes don't have shoelaces, do whatever you need to do, because difficult families are just another cost of doing business in seniors care. Now, I'm kind of embellishing that a bit, but it really, the basis of that is this belief that difficult families are there and there's nothing you can do about it. And what's become my life's work and mission is to say, no, it doesn't need to be that way. In fact, I think there's a different way of thinking about it, which is this. Are they difficult families, or is it a difficult family relationship? Because truly, if they're just a difficult family, then there's nothing you can do about it. They're just difficult. Are we going to assume that they're difficult all the time, everywhere, with everybody? Or is it a difficult family relationship because of what is occurring in that moment of coming into a home and dealing with the admission anxiety and all of the gaps and the narratives, the labels that we're putting onto them, right? Like Amy's coworkers, rude family, they're going to be difficult. And that really wasn't true. So I encourage you to think about that in far as how to be able to reframe that. I want to share a video of Carolyn, who you met last week, because there's a little piece of what she says, because I also want to talk about what I tend to hear as a common family narrative about long-term care.
Reading the book gave me some big shifts, understanding, like, I didn't even understand that. I should have known this. The staff were grieving the person that had been in my aunt's room prior to her. And I'm a very empathetic person. Once I clued in, because I didn't realize that the staff actually really cared.
So what I think is really interesting about that clip is this common narrative that sometimes families can have, that people who get paid to care don't really care. That's in essence what Carolyn was saying. And I also wanted to include that piece about having this new level of empathy, because she didn't realize that staff grieve when a resident passes away. And that's what created this enlightenment for her, that staff actually care. So as you can see, if a family's coming in with the belief system that staff who are paid to care don't really care, then how do you start building a form of trust, respect, and partnership? And when we're able to equip ourselves with understanding what the common narratives are that you experience, or the common narratives that we have, then it allows us to be able to be more intentional and proactive in redesigning that, so that we don't let these limiting beliefs kind of carry on and influence how somebody shows up. So what we're going to do at this point is we're going to do a breakout. And on page 9, you've got the family narratives. And it says to list the narratives families are bringing with them into your home. What are the limiting beliefs or assumptions or labels or stories that you're hearing? And I will share a few with you that I've heard consistently over dozens of workshops that I've done, just to help prime the pump. Because the other thing I would say is that sometimes this can feel uncomfortable, but the only way that we are able to really work with and move out of our way these limiting beliefs and narratives is to call them out, to then look at how we can reframe them. So some of the ones that I've heard is that first one that I just shared with you: people who are paid to care don't really care. Another narrative I've heard is that the belief that families think that if they're not nice, or if they complain, that the staff will take it out on their loved one. There's a narrative that, well, they're getting 24/7 one-on-one care, so my loved one's never going to have a fall. There's the narrative or the belief that if I ask questions, the staff are going to get defensive, and then it's going to become a whole thing. And another one is, well, now that they're in long-term care, every time that they call the call bell, it'll be answered immediately. So if some of those are resonating for you, feel free to put them on the list, but we want to be able to. Ferdoza is going to create breakout rooms. And I think, just looking at the number of people that are here. So now we're going to look at the other side of the relationship on page 10 in the workbook, to say, what are the narratives that your team typically has about families? What are the limiting beliefs, assumptions, or stories that we're hearing? And again, I'll prime the pump and give you some that I've heard that are pretty consistent. So some of the narratives can be, this family is going to be time consuming. There's this family's too involved, or this family's not involved enough. We've been burned before with challenging family relationships. So there tends to be this level of distrust with new families, like how are they going to be to work with? There can be the narrative of, it's really hard to please families because of the expectations. Going back to Allison's comment that if they're expecting a concierge service, then we're never going to be able to please them. That becomes the other side of the narrative. Or another one, particularly through all of the infection control practices, is that families aren't going to be compliant with the protocols that we have in place, particularly when there's an outbreak. So just those are some examples, but let's open it up again for people to share. what are some of the narratives that we have heard that staff can have about families that could get in the way of building that relationship? And there's this book that I'm currently reading called Seek. We'll put the name of the book and the author in the notes. How curiosity can transform your life and change the world. Doesn't that sound exciting? And he uses this line that I want to share with you. When we use curiosity as a practice of connection instead of only as an intellectual exercise, the goal isn't to know, but rather to understand. And that's really what we're talking about, is how do we better understand each other when there are some of those challenges in that, either in the work, the relationship, this key relationship between staff and families in the service and support of the resident. And he says, curiosity brings us closer to the humanity of the people around us, helping us to see and be seen in return. So Amy's experience was able to see the family and understand versus buy into the narrative. But she was also seen by the family as someone who really cared and was curious enough to want to make that connection in the humanity in that relationship, which I just think is so incredibly powerful. The other thing with curiosity, and in my first book, Recipe for Empathy, when I was doing some research on it, they say that actually curiosity, it lowers mortality rate, increases our level of self-esteem, and gives us a higher life satisfaction, all done based on research. And so this opportunity to tap into, and you'll see on page 12, where on that page of curiosity, I've got, I'm curious or I wonder. In order to be able to shift into curiosity, that's really the easiest way to do it, is to say, you know, I'm curious. I'd really love to better understand how I can strengthen our relationship, me as a family member, you as a staff member. Or I wonder what it would look like if we 100% trusted each other all the time in our relationship together. And I'm just making these questions up, but it's a way to be able to create that fast track to curiosity. Because the other thing with curiosity is that it cancels out judgment and anger. Like, it's not possible to be curious and judgmental or angry at the same time. Try it next time. If you can catch yourself and having a reaction to something, to go, you know, I'm really curious what's actually going on here, or if we find ourselves judging somebody else. And, you know, when I mentioned before about this relational deficit that we're starting, it really is about how do we make contributions to this relational bank account. If we think about every time we're having a conversation or an interaction, we're making a little deposit into that relational bank account with that family member, with that staff member. And I want to share, it's a conversation that I just had yesterday, so it's still fresh in my mind, and I hope I do it justice. But I was on a call with a group of administrators, and we were talking about grief. And you'll recall last week, we talked about that you're not just meeting the family, you're meeting their grief. And this conversation was about grief that staff feel, particularly when a resident passes away, as well as the grief that families can feel. And so this one administrator shared this story about how for the last few weeks, the numbers of the amount of boost supplement that's being consumed in the home has gone up, and they couldn't figure out why. And somebody was able to determine that one of the residents, a woman who has boost in her dietary plan, in her care plan already, the son comes in to see her about 3 times a day. She's not doing well and is declining. And so every time the son comes in, he asks the staff if he can have an extra boost to be able to give to her. And what she said was, you know, thinking about grief and how you're not just meeting the family, you're meeting your grief, helped to heighten her awareness of why people do certain things. So she brought in kind of a level of curiosity. And what she shared was, you know, recognizing that what the son is going through. It's a loss of his mom and who she was, and that perhaps him wanting to have this extra boost to sit with her, to provide nourishment and nurturing, is a way of trying to get back a little bit of control out of things that he's feeling not in control of. And she said, he comes here and he does what he can control, maybe make her life a bit better, make her live a bit longer, or whatever he's trying to do. But she said, I think we just need to be aware sometimes and be curious about why families do the things they do. They aren't trying to be difficult. He's not trying to be demanding. And yes, as an organization, we could say he's already receiving this, it's in his care plan, it's part of the funding, but anything extra, you can pick it up and bring it in yourself. She's like, no, that this is a small gesture in being able to provide that additional little bit of support so that he can feel some sense of control and be able to sit there with his mom and feel like he's helping her. And, you know, she said, sometimes we have to remember that families are grieving, and they're grieving the loss of the person as they are declining. And that changes how they are with us. And I wanted to share that because, you know, I thought it's not about the boost, right? It's about playing a part. Like it was so profound as she shared it, and her level of awareness that this is a little contribution that we're making in this relationship in the final days or weeks or however long he has with his mom, that we're able to bring our humanity. And it really was sparked by that level of curiosity and choosing another narrative. The family's not being demanding and having high expectations. We can help with this one. So as we wrap up, we've got a few minutes for questions. I wanted just to highlight for you that with what we've talked about today in the podcast that I have called The Empathy Exchange, episode 4 is really an audio masterclass of some of the things that we've talked about today in a little bit more detail. Are your narratives creating friction between staff and families? And I think you may also enjoy episode 5. It was an interview with a friend and colleague of mine who's navigated a long journey as a family member. And although her mom and her dad and now her in-laws, it's in assisted living memory care, it's still very relevant to the long-term care journey. So I think that you'll get some good insights from that. So, so I think we can open it up for Q&A. And also just curious, if you want to put in the chat or come off mute, is what was the most important idea you got from this session that you'll use in the next 7 days? So you can give that some thought, and any questions, we've got 5 minutes that we can wrap things up with. Barbara.
So one of the things I think I'll take with me and use over the next 7 days will be turning my judgment into curiosity. I think that's an excellent way of looking at that. And it's funny, right after you said, think about it, I kind of thought about it in my head, something that I was just with personal life, just with a friend, something I was kind of judging her about. And I thought, yeah, if I kind of look at that curiously, yeah, it does set a different tone. So I think that's something I will pursue, change my thought process there.
It's an ongoing process. I mean, we are hardwired to judge and give advice. So it's in our DNA. And so the natural reaction is we're creating a story and we are judging, but then to turn it around and be curious. And I actually just heard on a podcast I was listening to this morning, something to the effect of, when we stop taking things personally, we gain perspective. And I think that that's really important and something that I'm continuing to reflect on, because when we take things personally, that's sometimes where the judgment comes out. And when we're able to step away from it and look at the bigger picture, it gives us a different perspective, right? Going back to Amy and the perspective that they weren't being rude, they weren't being difficult, they were grieving and they were scared. So thank you for that. Who else? Yeah, thank you, Gladys. Just looking at your comment, encourage staff to be curious, thinking about why families do what they do. The other thing I neglected to mention was on page 11, the redesign the narrative. These are just questions for reflection. And, you know, the whole, what do you want your families to know and believe about your homes and staff? Like, you have agency, you have the ability to impact and influence and rewrite some of the narratives by taking the time to really think about even if you pick, what are the top 3 that we think that we're dealing with, and how can we be proactive with being able to help rewrite that narrative? Okay. So next week we've got same time next week, we're going to be talking about expectations. And expectations is a big topic, right? And how to be able to clarify, adjust, manage expectations. Got some tools that I'll be sharing with you. So hopefully would love to see you again next week. And I will turn it over to Firdoza.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Deborah. That was amazing. So before we wrap up, just wanted to again give, for those who was here last week, I gave an introduction to our Learning Collaborative. We do have a session next week, but if you haven't heard of our Learning Collaborative, it is basically a forum for healthcare organizations interested in creating caregiver inclusive setting. It is designed to be an interactive session where we share knowledge, strategies for different challenges and solutions. So yeah, we do have a session scheduled for tomorrow from 1 to 2 p.m. If you're not registered but would like to attend the session, please feel free to email me and I'll send you a link for the Zoom session. Next slide. So here are our other education opportunities. At the bottom is our Learning Collaborative, of course, and then we do have a save the date for privacy and consent session with a lawyer. So that's scheduled for March 5th from 11 to 12:30 for long-term care homes. We will be sending out the flyers hopefully in the coming days. For everyone who's registered, I will be sharing the link for that as well. And yeah, next slide. Again, thank you so much for coming in today. Please note we will be sharing the slides and the link to the recording in a post-webinar email in the days following the session. I'll see everybody again either next week or possibly tomorrow for our Learning Collaborative. Again, thank you again for coming in today. Have a great day. Bye-bye.